We're going to continue on and do questions. What is included in utilities? Is it just water or electricity, or does it also include phone and internet? I think we talked about it once before, but it's the top question. Would you mind repeating the answer to that?
Sure. Utilities currently for the church include electricity, water, heating oil, phone, internet, and we even talked about the if you will the sanitation, the dumpster pickup, if you will. We're also thinking that you should include, it may or may not be forgiven, but it is legitimate in our shelter at home, social distancing environment. The utility costs, if you will, associated with internet and cell phone expense for your employees who are indeed still working for the church, and that's how they are able to work. So if you're reimbursing employees for those two, it may or may not be forgiven, but you can certainly, we encourage you to submit that as part of the package. If they're just, if you wouldn't normally pay for it otherwise, and they're not a key part and it's not part of their work environment, that's probably a little more aggressive than we're comfortable recommending.
This is a popular question. Sean is asking, we have a preschool and we'll be paying our teachers through the end of May with the PPP funds. Our teachers normally do not get paid in June or July. How does this affect loan forgiveness? And this is a big, broad question for all churches who've got schools and preschools that adjust their schedules for the summer. What counsel are you giving? I know you're hearing this a lot.
So it does become nuanced because, again, depending on if you're on a bi-weekly or semi-monthly, the number of payrolls you might be able to work in, then certainly there's going to be an impact if they aren't getting paid in the summer at all versus, I'm thinking more of a K-12 situation, working with several of those right now where, the faculty are paid on an annual basis, even though they're only teaching on contract for 9 or 10 months. Certain administrators carry on. Certainly, paraprofessional staff and certain what we call campus staff in the cafeteria, otherwise who are not working, would go off. Those all play into that seasonal calculation. But beyond that, I would have to look specifically at what that looks like. If it really is, the preschool shuts down at the end of May and closes up for June, then certainly, some of those funds, you could, again, they will not be forgivable because you will not have met that 8-week window apart from some other descriptors. Unless you got it early and you could count some of April still. But, certainly if you will not be able to count payroll costs beyond the time that you aren't paying payroll, or at least the majority of folks. If you have an administrator still on year round, those will still be allowable. And those calculations will play in based on, the 5 factors that we talked about. Very nuanced.
FTE is going to be affected in that because you're going to, if they end, they're going to have a lower FTE count. Is that going to change their forgivability as well?
So potentially, and again, that's where it comes back, where several things play out. One would be on the FTEs, you can go to the seasonal. And so if you go back, we talked a little bit about the fact that we're not sure how the SBA is going to count. Is it going to be the beating hearts, i.e. the number of social security numbers? Are they going to look at FTEs? So there's 3 potential calculations. Beyond that, then from seasonal employment, which is what this preschool would have, you can look at either the January, February, if that's most advantageous, or you can go back and look at previous February to June. And that might actually be the best way to do the average FTE or the average employment for that period, recognizing that it is seasonal. It wouldn't surprise me if at some point there's a provision that's specifically made for schools, recognizing that their seasonality is different than it's called retail or other industries. So there may be some further nuance coming. We're unaware of that at this point. But
okay, so this is really nuanced to you. a best practice that we're seeing from Horizons is that if you've got preschool and you're paying them and you're using this, that they are actually delivering services to those at-home students that messages so much better in your church. One possibility would be to continue and extend that out to use those funds and by continuing to deliver those services. Is that correct, Stan?
It is, and we are working with several organizations who, again, because they're staying at home, and even if they would normally have ended in May when school was out, recognizing that a lot of parents will need to be going back to work to get caught up and being called back to work. Some preschools and some schools are actually considering staying open in June, either through camps or some other arrangement where they can actually have students back in the classroom potentially, or even distance learning otherwise. But that would be where you're literally extending the service. The children are, the students are still participating, and there's an activity going on. To arbitrarily pay someone when the school's done and there's no students would be a high risk transaction.
Okay. So Brittany asked if an employee resigns during the 8-week loan period, what is going to be the impact to the calculations? That's going to hit under the FTE calculation?
It will. So it both hit there. It's a reduced headcount, and it'll also hit in the fact that there's reduced payroll. Now, that being said, assuming that person leaves and you can backfill and replace it with somebody else fairly quickly, the difference will be the gap between the person leaving and the person coming in. So if one person leaves on Friday and the other person comes in on Monday, really there is no gap. But if there's a 2-week gap, then you're going to lose that window. And if they actually come back in before the end of the 8-week period, that FTE, that headcount stays up, but the payroll drops. So those become, conversely, if somebody resigns at the, a week before it's over, most likely the payroll will stay the same because they'll have some, some payout probably from vacation or something, but the FT will be gone at some point. So those become very, very nuanced, specific to the church and the timing of that resignation, departure from the group, and how quickly you backfill it otherwise. And again, coming back to the original thought, this is to help the organization, the employer, keep everybody working at a general level of pay. And so if you were already planning for that to not replace that person, then certainly, being forgiven for vacant position, it's not the intent of the plan either.
So we've got a very popular question here. Elaine asked it, 59 people have given it an upvote. What is your advice on taking PPP loan funds, even if you've not seen a decline in giving? There's still uncertainty. That was the first group. Second group is liquidity about the future. But as of today, giving is still strong. What would you advise in regard to should we take those funds or should we not take those funds? And let us say that a significant number of churches, not a majority, but a significant number of churches are seeing significantly improved giving. Most are in that sort of moderate range of very close to previous giving. So this is a question that applies broadly across the board.
I would certainly say the funds as it's being defined was really intended to help protect payroll, to help protect the employees and keep them engaged. If you don't see that as a risk anytime soon, if it's just, if you already have access to capital through lines of credit or notes, if you are not already over leveraged, then I don't know that I would just, put my hand out to take a freebie that ends up being at least a 1% loan otherwise. If you don't need it, don't anticipate needing it, now you're just taking a loan that won't be forgiven. And you're paying interest on something, it's that risk factor. That comes back into that whole faith piece of where are we as a church? It really is. So yeah, that ends up being a church leadership decision. I think needs to be prayerfully considered. So.
All right. So Caitlin asked this question: can raises or bonuses be awarded during the 8-week period of time?
So I would be hesitant to do that. I think a rule of thumb would be, do you want that? Do you want to be in the newspaper that you use these funds to pay, do bonuses? The intent is to keep people employed. If it's on the front page of the newspaper that you're doing pay raises with it and paying bonuses with it, I don't know that that would, meet the standard of the intent of the plan.
So we do have churches that are, they may have a food bank that they're still operating. They're paying employees a hazard pay in this window of time that's based upon the additional risks that they may be taking. Would that be forgivable in your view?
Great question. I think it's a legitimate expense. It's certainly, as you call it, a hazard pay, recognizing the front line's efforts and the risks that they're incurring for themselves personally as well as their family. I think the documentation of why that hazard pay is being given appropriately and then applying for it, recognizing that that portion may or may not be forgiven, but certainly the stronger evidence and support that you grant for it, documenting the need and the impact on the community, I think would certainly give for a much stronger position. But I think it's too early to tell whether the SBA will forgive that or not. But I certainly think that would be a legitimate attempt, an allowable attempt.
Caitlin asked another question that very popular. Is payroll calculated by pay date or pay period?
Great question, and that's a both and. And that's what we're trying to get clarity from the SBA. The incurred and paid is what references the date paid versus the days worked. And so that becomes the big question that needs to be solved globally in reference to payroll.
So we're really looking for some additional guidance on that. We think there'll be clarity on that. Jan asked this question, 48 people upvoted it. On the PPP application, the question was number of employees, but in reading the forgiveness information, it references, which are two entirely different things. Given we answered the application with the number of employees, not FTEs, so when we go to apply forgiveness, we're going to have a hard time hitting the number on the application. Do we send a corrected application? What do we do?
So yeah, at this point, once you've got your application in and you've gotten your funding, that goes back to reinforce what we said, set those funds aside in a separate bank account. And the reality is the number of employees was the application process, and we are going to continue to see changes on the forgiveness portion because even the FTE is a totally different number than the number of employees. As I said, on the application, it's how many Social Security numbers, how many distinct paychecks do we have? The forgiveness portion is on the FTE side, A, and B, there's currently two calculations that the SBA uses. We're not sure which one they're picking, or if they will revert back to the application one of how many Social Security numbers you have. And that's the clarity as well that we're looking for, that we would hope to see probably within the next, certainly within 6 weeks, as those who've already received their funding are starting to, will be applying for those forgiveness. The SBA will have to define it by then or give an extension.
So Jim asked a question. Our bank also will not include any non-941 employees, so no clergy, housing allowance. That's the situation they're in. I think we talked about this earlier. The SBA has clarified. Well, I'll let you answer the question.
So yeah, certainly that becomes one of those gray areas where the lending institution may or may not include clergy and or their housing allowance, whether they've exempted out of Social Security, et cetera. When it actually comes to the SBA, they're acknowledging that this is one of those nuanced areas. And just like banks and the federal government, even now, when you're doing your W-2s and your 941s, you do include your clergy there, as a head count. And there's always reconciliations that say, when the clergy gets their W-2, when they get their 941, it outlines, here's what the clergy received. And so then you tie it back and you do your reconciliations between your payroll records and your 941s to demonstrate here are the differences, and it's related to the clergy and their housing allowance, and then whether or not they've opted in or out of Social Security or not, the impact and relationship there. And again, very nuanced. Just like the employer can't count their employer payroll taxes, clergy most likely will only be allowed to count half of the self-employment tax. Just like, you know, they would be able to discount the employee portion, but not the employer portion, which is the SECA tax. Again, SBA has not talked about that because that's so nuanced and it's so such a small sector of what they're dealing with right now. They're dealing with all the other global issues first. We will see soon, or you know, on the tail end of this, further clarity, and it may end up being where it gets challenged before they really understand what the issue is, as churches start submitting, or you know, ministry organizations start submitting their loan forgiveness documents that support clergy with housing allowances, and in particular those who've opted out of Social Security otherwise.
Stan, Rich asked this question: our PPP funds have been received. Can we pay our employees for periods that have been missed to bring them whole as of today? So I think what he's asking is if we have not, if we like laid some people off, can we reimburse them for those periods?
The PPP funds have not been intended to pay for February, March, and certainly, you know, even like this month, the question is, can you reimburse or can you count for the funds for that have not been incurred at the time you received the loan? So certainly going back to fund furloughed employees, I don't know, certainly that would be beyond the scope of the forgiveness clause. I would need to check to see if it's in the allowable portion or not, but it could be that you could use your own funds to do that if you so chose. I think that, you know, there's a lot of other policy issues there, and you know, that would certainly be a very specific, nuanced question for the church and leadership to decide outside of, can you use these funds? Certainly do not believe that those would be forgivable. That one specifically, I would need to check to see if it's allowable with those funds.
So Mary asked this question: we just received our money. Preschool teachers will be paid for the next 5 weeks. I understand this loan can be used for payroll going back to March 13th. Does that mean we can count payroll we paid between March 13th and the time we received the loan?
That one I'd have to research specifically. You know, that's a very specific one to a client, you know, that has ramifications. Conceptually, I'm prepared to discuss, but when it comes to specific, I need to look at a lot of documentation to understand before I can give an opinion publicly like this.
Okay. We do have to say that Stan is a licensed CPA. He's giving information out today, and he has to be cautious in what he knows versus what he thinks. This may be, again, as we follow up and look at some of the specifics that come up, this would be a great one to cover there. Great question from Deborah. Can I hire a temporary employee and have their salary covered by this loan?
Yes, you can hire a temporary employee and cover them with the loan documents. Again, they would count within that window as an FTE, and a way to, you know, their compensation would also be included.
So this would apply in a situation where I had an employee resign. We want to go through a more detailed search process, but I could hire somebody immediately to temporarily fill that position. Those funds would be covered, and we could go through the search process while still having someone fill in that gap.
Correct. If they're on payroll, they count.
Okay. Daniel asked this question: if we have access to invested endowments rather than liquid, do we pass the new FAQ requirement that takes into account other sources of liquidity to support their ongoing operations? This is a great question. A lot of our churches have endowments. Give us some clarity as to whether those endowments, and in what circumstances would those endowment funds be counted as liquidity?
That's a really good question, Joe, and it might take a little bit of time to define. So let me just talk about it conceptually. versus specifically. Number one is endowments are what we would normally consider permanently restricted assets. And so with that come a lot, either they're permanently restricted or temporarily restricted. But many times when we get to an endowment specifically as a technical term, it implies that the corpus, the principal cannot be used, only the proceeds from its earnings can be used. There are other types of temporary restricted that have a sunset clause, or that the funds, the principal and earnings can be used for specific identified restricted programs and ministries, et cetera. So given that backdrop of an endowment and the potential restrictions, that becomes very, very nuanced in the fact that not all endowments are truly liquid to the church. Now, there may be some where there is a nice endowment and it's unrestricted as far as its earnings, and it has accrued over time, that the balance has grown substantially from the original principal. And there are a lot of earnings that have been saved into that fund that are available for use. In that particular case, where you have a large endowment, where those funds are available for use, most likely you would fall in that category that you have other assets and funding available, capital available for the church operations. Let me come to the other side. If you have a building fund that is restricted and you've set aside $5 million for either a new building or a significant remodel or renovation, those are designated funds that you aren't legally, or in an accounting language, allowed to use except for that's intended purpose. Those are not liquid to the organization to use for an alternative purpose that has been restricted by the donor. Another example would be there are donor restricted contributions that come in that get set aside, for example, to missionaries or other agencies that may come in on a per Sunday offering, and they're accumulated and paid periodically, whether it's monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and the church is gathering those, and so it's sitting in the bank account somewhere, and it could be a substantial amount. But those aren't available for operations. Those have been restricted for a donor-specific purpose. So with that backdrop, just because you have a lot of money in the bank, you need to understand whose money is it, and is it available for these operations in this time frame. So that would be the caveat there.
I just want to come back and summarize that. You presented new information today about the liquidity test. This is going to be a big, big question with churches. And so I'm going to repeat back what I think I heard you say, and you can tell me if it is correct. Endowment funds that are restricted are not available for liquidity, and even to the degree that you have a building fund or a missions fund set aside, those are where the donor gave for a specific purpose. You would view those as restricted and not available for liquidity.
Correct. Apart from, for example, if you have a building fund, and we'll create this straw man, you have a building fund of $5 million towards whatever that capital project is for your church. As a congregation, you can get together and say, are we okay changing our plans and not building that and reallocate those funds for something else? But then those donors who contributed have to be contacted and get their permission to redirect the funds. If it's a permanent endowment where you can't let's call it something over the life of the church, you've had $1 million worth of contributions come into this endowment, and you've been sitting on it, and that endowment investment is now worth $5 million, and it's just for the general uses of the church. $4 million of that would indeed be available. The $1 million is permanently restricted and cannot be spent. So again, the nuances become very, very specific to the donor intent, whether it's temporarily restricted, permanently restricted, and can you contact the donor to redirect. But apart from that, you would not be able to use those differently.
I think where churches are going to get caught is they have allocated funds into sinking funds for like a trustees fund where they've taken general unrestricted dollars and put them into various funds. Those are going to be viewed as liquidity to the church and could be problematic in the forgiveness side.
Correct. So if you've allocated funds or set them aside as management without donor restriction, but there's just a part of the operating budget where you're setting aside, if you will, surplus dollars for future capital expenditures or projects, those would be considered liquid and available.